Hi everyone, thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where we focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change effectively. My guests cover a diverse number of critical topics to enable change adoption, including communication, leadership, training, change practice, process design, change capability, and much more. My name is Ali Juma. Today I'm joined by the global change management consultant Euan to chat about change portfolio management and the role of data in enabling better change adoption and experience. Euan is the founder of Change Compass, which is a digital tool that helps businesses drive transformation success and balance business performance through a single view of change. I'm grateful to have Euan chatting to me today. So, Euan, thank you so much for joining the Inner Game of Change podcast. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Ali. I'm really looking forward to it, and it's a good time to be talking about change management.
Fantastic. Euan, I know you've got a story behind where you are in terms of managing your business and the Change Compass. So do you want to share with the listeners your story and how you ended up going solo with your business?
Yeah, absolutely, Ali. So this started quite a number of years ago when I was working for National Australia Bank down in Melbourne.
Yes.
So I actually worked overseas for quite a long time, over 10 years in different countries. And when I came back to Australia, because I was just, missing home and just needed to be closer to my family, came back, I started a job working for NAB as a head of change. And one of the key things I was trying to solve that was a huge pain to me was how do I implement changes, quite a huge number of changes across different parts of the bank, and be able to know what those changes were. It sounds like a very simple problem, right? But yet a lot of companies don't have a complete picture of what are the changes, how they're impacting different parts of the business.
Yes.
And be able to use that to manage the change, right? Because I guess as change professionals, if we don't know what is changing, how do we manage change? So essentially that was really the pain that I had. And there wasn't really an easy solution. There were lots of ad hoc spreadsheets that were not updated. Lots of departments were just complaining that they somehow just found out about the changes in the last minute.
Yeah.
And so it gave me an idea of, there has to be a better way to do this, and perhaps through digital means. And so when I left the bank, some of the ideas I took to market, and that evolved to become the Change Compass.
Right.
And so, so we've been doing this for more than 5 years, and it's been a challenging transition from being a change practitioner through to being an entrepreneur and a digital business.
So you're going through change management yourself now?
Yeah, it has been, for a number of years. And, it's like anything, right? When you go through a transition, you're all learning a lot about, the new ways of working yourself.
Of course.
Yeah.
It just means that you're learning, but at the same time, you're delivering to the market as well. So you're having lunch and you're learning at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. It's I think for me, what I found really exciting was a lot of the things I've learned in managing a digital business within the digital environment. And there's a lot of things that, digital business can do very quickly, very cheaply, and very effectively that larger companies struggle with just because of the hierarchies and scales and different ways of working.
Yes. Yeah. Since you mentioned that your business and your organization started about 5 years ago, have you noticed any shift in how the market perceives the discipline, as in change management?
You mean how the market perceives change management in general?
Yes, as a discipline,
Yeah.
and the value of the discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ali, so I would say 5 years ago when we first started, a lot of organizations were still in the space of just doing the minimum when it comes to managing change.
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's around just having contractors, working on different projects.
Yes.
And essentially that's what they call change management.
Yeah.
But I think over the years, we've met a lot more organizations that have really focused, invested, and beefed up their change presence within the organization, whether it's having a change practice, having a change center of excellence, or not even that. Or, sometimes it's just within the operations, having people actually focused on managing change within operations, not in the change practice. So we've seen a lot of examples, a lot of our clients in the US, and we've seen the biggest change in that market.
Great. And it sounds like you've been well positioned to deliver to those industries. You did talk about it's important to understand all the changes happening within an organization. You're talking about portfolio management and the importance of understanding the ecosystem. Why is it important to understand all of this rather than focusing on changes individually?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, Ali. So when we think about change from the end user's perspective, we think of the change that's happening to them, whether it's 1, 2, or 5 or 10. End users don't necessarily separate the different changes. They're thinking, I'm going through these change experiences. Some of them overlap, some of them are individual, some of them are happening concurrently. And so, if we somehow, because of the way we're structured, we separate them individually, that's not necessarily going to give us the best outcome, because the experience is most of the time intertwined from the end user perspective, right? So when your project is being rolled out, you care about your project because that's how teams are organized within the organization, right? By design, that's how we designed it. However, the experience, on the other hand, from the end user is not really divided in that way. The end user goes through experiences in a way that's all encompassing. And so, the better we can understand what that holistic experience is, the better we can get much more value and outcome from the change that we're driving. So we may not be responsible for other changes, but if we don't at least understand and take that into account, then we're not really looking at the change experience overall.
By looking at the picture holistically, you will look at efficiencies as well, financial efficiencies, cost efficiencies. The whole aim of it, my understanding, it's an attempt to minimize any conflict and any saturation, which ultimately, usually that friction creates the fatigue that we keep talking about, which ultimately will impact how an individual feels about change as an experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. So when we think about really looking at the various change experiences and how they add up together, there's a lot you could do with that picture, right? So you could say, how do we better, prioritize, sequence, and reorder the changes? That's usually the first thing that people think about. But there's other things you could do, right? You could say, well, actually, how about if we better package some of the changes together and combine it as a single release, versus having lots and lots of different releases that are just like, being stabbed by 1,000 cuts, right?
Yes.
That's the analogy I've often heard as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to add as well is you could also say that, well, if I'm looking at purely from a delivery perspective within my project, there's a lot of things I could tag onto in terms of what other projects are doing. You know, if they're releasing these communications, conducting town halls, is it better from a end user experience perspective for us to do that together? To release, 2 emails versus 10 within the same week, something like that, right? Or for us to look at how do we, really order and integrate our content for learning in a way that makes much more sense for the end user versus just doing it ourselves.
Yes. Is that easy though, Euan? Knowing that, especially if you work in a big organization, driven by different budgets, different deadlines.
Yeah, look, it comes from awareness, right? The awareness of these are the things that are happening to this stakeholder group that we're working with. And I would say that the easiest thing to do is, if you don't have much in terms of information, just ask your stakeholders what else are they going to go through at that period of time. That's probably the best and easiest thing to do. Ideally, you would want a very clear and easy picture of the data of all the various impacts across the different business units, what types of changes they are, and be able to really use that information to better plan in advance. But in the absence of that, at least ask the question and use that to really start the process.
Yeah, and one of the things that I also learned from managing or looking at the holistic view and the ecosystem of change is actually it minimizes any noise. So sometimes a business unit will be saying there's too much change happening. But when you drill it down and you really understand the impact, you might think that, a business unit may have 3 changes happening, but really one of the changes is only impacted one person. And so and so that's the beauty of knowledge is important rather than a perception. And that will help to minimize any noise. You always hear it. There's too much change. That's right. That is a very naive statement to make, especially if it comes from a leader. And so we hope that by presenting that information and portfolio view or a dashboard, whatever you want to call it, will actually help, it help dismiss any sort of myths out there that there's actually too much change. And if you get into the luxury of actually, having a say in the sequencing of the change, that will be a good place to be.
Yeah, exactly. So, we often hear from, companies that leaders are saying, yes, there's too much change. The thing is, when you think about that statement, there's a lot that is actually behind that statement. Because often what we see is it's actually political statements, because they are calling out that there is too much change because they would rather have a lower volume of change. They would rather not have to deal with the changes and have things as a BAU, so that if they say there's too much change, if that leads to having less change, then it somehow is easier for them to manage their operations. So often that's what we hear. So number one, the first thing is there actually too much change just because someone is calling that out?
Yeah.
Are they saying that because it's a political movement to try and aim for receiving less change, versus the fact that they actually are just at breaking point, which is a separate issue? But then you've got someone else who actually is experiencing the same change, but they could be dealing with that much better because they've got better leadership, better capability, better organization, better trust, that for the same amount of change, they're actually not really seeing that as a breaking point or change saturation level. So I think there's a lot that we have to really dig deep to find out exactly what that's actually saying and really verify whether that's, what's actually behind that statement as well.
Yeah, it is a disheartening statement that I hear sometimes, but also, like you, it only motivates me to, gather the data and share the data. And actually, not just with the leaders. In an organization that I joined probably about couple of years ago, I actually shared it with all the business units as in team members. Then they realized, so the underlying message is that we hear you, there is a lot of change, but we need to dig deep and understand the impact of each change, because that's where the story is. It's actually the impact, because we are in a dynamic environment now, and there is no other way but to keep changing and evolving. You can't stay still now. I mean, imagine if you work in organizations like Apple, like Facebook, like Google. These organizations changes in their DNA constantly. But how they manage it and understand the impact is something they're really good at as well, and the sequencing of it.
Yeah, exactly. So to answer your previous question about how different companies have changed in terms of how they see change management over the years. One interesting thing I've observed is for a lot of the huge tech companies, and I used to work for Intel myself for quite a few years, they've never really had a change management presence until recently. So 10 years ago, like change management as a function did not exist. When I was at Intel, it was pretty much embedded as a capability for leadership. So you join Intel, you get trained on change management at every level. So it's really one of those things you would just kind of learn as part of what you do. And it wasn't really a separate discipline. But if you look at all of those companies, including Apple, AWS, Google, all of them have change managers now, which is even 5 years ago, I think a lot of them would not have as many of that in the organization. So it's definitely changing, and that's absolutely the trend. The other thing I was just going to add to what you were saying as well is, when we look at the amount of change and the change saturation, I mean, it's really powerful what data can provide for us if we actually are able to collect data and use it. Because when you have data, your people can make much better decisions. They can look at the data, they get focused on it. It's almost a bit like giving someone one of those, whether it's Apple Watch or one of those step counters. And so if you have that, what you're doing is all of a sudden you start to focus on it as the first thing. And then secondly, you start to look at it. And over time, you actually start to figure out what if I did A or B? What would that mean in terms of the data that I'm looking at? So even if you weren't a change manager or change practitioner, you start to focus on how do I get better at this? And guess what? Over time, you do. Trial and error.
Sure. Let's just expand a little bit on the data topic, Euan. First of all, where do you get the data from? And the second thing is, what's the best way to present data around change management to leaders and organizations?
Yeah, so if you look at the data for change, there's a lot of different types of data, right? So there's the project-specific data. There is the business operations side of the capability data, whether it's maturity or capability, leadership, etc. There's also the portfolio side of the data. So there's a lot of different types of data, right? So if you dive in, for example, into just focused on what is changing, what is the change, and what that data involves, we would really be looking at the basics around, okay, what type of change is it? How fast is that change going? What are the dates in which the impacts are happening to which stakeholder groups in what part of the business? Is it everyone in those groups or the particular role specifically? And then also things like what geographies or what locations, what level of change are we driving? Is it, are those impacts high or medium at that particular point in time? So there's a lot of, just even those data points I talked about, there's quite a lot of those data points already. And I guess within a project, you would know that right? Because as a change practitioner, you would know exactly what that entails. And hopefully your stakeholders will know that as well, because if they're very clear in terms of what the change involves, they should be able to answer those questions quite easily. Now, let's maybe dive into another example. At a portfolio level, you'd be looking at things like, okay, when we lift up one level to look at a lot of those impacts across the board, what are the hotspots across different parts of the organization, not just in terms of the volume of the change, but also in terms of the pace of the change. And then how that actually overlaps with, for example, your, strategic plan. Your plan was to deliver X by X date. Are your milestones on track in terms of how the changes are going?
Yeah.
How are you, measuring and tracking the adoption and realization of those implementation and the benefits? And on the other hand, from wearing a operations and business hat, I guess those guys would be more concerned about, how is my operational indicators going to be impacted at any point in time? Because they're thinking, okay, how do I manage my BAU and the changes at the same time? And on top of that, how do I achieve my KPI targets, any business improvement targets with the changes that I'm going through as well?
Yes.
So there's a lot of different levels and different aspects we'd be looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. I also, to add to that, is also a couple of things that I usually look at is the nature of or the culture in a particular business unit when the change is happening. So let's just say you've got a couple of changes happening that will impact PNC or the frontline staff. Then we dig deep into the leadership. Let's just say that particular business unit, there are a few changes happening, but also they've got a change in leadership. Now, that's a very disruptive change, and that's another data point to understand that perhaps the timing of rolling out this particular change would need to slow down because we've got a new leader, or if there's going to be a change in restructuring, and all of those things are actually disruptors. But completely agree, the fear factor or the uncertainty that comes around success factors and the KPIs and the impact of them, which takes us always back to when we design the change, we have to give allowance to embed a good, successful, positive change. Sometimes a business unit would need to slow down a little bit to get the change embedded.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. And I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head, Ali. So, we need to think broadly about what's in the interest of the business. And there's a lot of factors we have to really balance, right? So yes, we want to ensure that we don't negatively disrupt the business through the changes we're rolling out. On the other hand, as part of their journey, what do they need to develop as part of their business capability so that the next few changes that we're rolling out or other projects rolling out, this would actually help them to develop their capability. So, it's a balance around, do we back off and implement the change a bit slower, versus do we ramp it up a little bit harder so that they're actually going to be much more ready for other larger changes later down the line. So it's a bit of a strategic decision to really think holistically about what's really in the interest of the business versus just the activities I'm doing.
Yes. Hi there. Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more podcasts, check us out at theinnergameofchange.com.au. I just want to go back to also mention something about the data. The data, from my observation and from a few experiences, is that maybe 10 years ago or maybe 5-6 years ago, I was naive enough to think that I collect all the data and therefore we're ready to go and then we've got all the information that we need. Only to realize later that I need to look at the data validation at the start of the project during the implementation and after the implementation. Because parameters change, behaviors change, delivery changes. And so we need to always remember that whatever data we've got, we keep that data that dynamic and updated at all times because things change during the implementation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, Ali, it's a really interesting point because we're actually, the world that we're in the beginning of a major data revolution.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that all across different companies that are around us. I mean, there isn't one company that isn't starting some kind of data or digitization effort. And in fact, pretty much nearly all the companies that I've looked at that you see in the news, every single one of them focused on data analytics and digitization. And so I think for us, the challenge for change management is we're still pretty much stuck in how we do things like 10, 15 years ago, where we would have a fairly structured way of saying we need to measure things at particular points in time.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, but that's actually the minimum that we need to be doing. When you think about all the other ways that, business practices are changing around us, it's no longer good enough to just measure it at a specific point in time every few months. The business within operations, procurement, finance, even HR, they're actually getting data continuously.
Mm-hmm.
They do pulse surveys,
yes.
Even through how people interact with Yammer, other corporate messaging systems. They're able to actually see on a weekly basis what are the sentiments, are there particular trends, who are the influencers. So I think, in this data revolution, we need to actually realize that things are changing very fast, and we're actually a little bit on the back foot when it comes to adopting some of the practices that a lot of the disciplines have already moved into. And I think definitely in sort of 5 or so years time, we'll start to see a lot of the changes where, even in project delivery, we'll see that it's not just sending 2 surveys or 3 surveys. It'll be continuous.
Yes. Yeah.
It'll be in a way that it's very easy for users to indicate the sentiments, ask questions, get individual guidances, and for us to track how the project's going in a very easy and digitized way, much more than we're able to at the moment.
So what you're talking about here is that, and which I strongly believe in, because the world is dynamic now, our traditional linear, approaches will no longer be as effective as we'd like them to be. And so we need to move away from a plan-based approach to a feedback-based approach. And that feedback loop will shape up, your change experience at the end of the day. Because if you look at the average, delivery of a project, it's 3 to 6 months. By the time you start the project and you finish, so many things have changed. And so that feedback driven is really important. And that puts a lot of pressure back on the change practitioners because you need to be able to have a finger on the pulse and understand how you can actually, the magic word, be agile as much as you can with the aim of relying on the data and sharing that insight with the leadership of a particular organization so you can tweak your practices. But the whole aim behind it is that how do you land that positive experience?
Absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think in the next 5, even in the next 5 years, we're going to start to see, what we call the analytical flywheel, where, in each of the businesses, they're getting a lot more agile. They're getting a lot more analytical. They have access to a lot more data within their daily businesses. So they're going to use to operate and think in that way of what is the data telling me? What do I need to do differently? How do I tweak something? It's not something major, but it's just doing something a little bit differently and pivot a little, even by the week or by the month. And so they would look at change and think, okay, how do we do the same with change? Because change should be how we manage the business overall. Right? Change shouldn't be something that's separate, sitting in a box in other departments.
Yes. Yeah. Change management is a capability that should not be outsourced to one person. It's a collective responsibility. When I look at data, also I look at it from, especially when it comes to change, because there's a lot of perception based feedback. I look at it from, the two types that people usually talk about, the soft data and these hard data. In your experience, do we need to look at both?
Oh, absolutely. I think as change practitioners, we're actually really good at looking at soft data.
Yes.
We're great at, really testing out what are the sentiments in our stakeholder groups. We're great at having the conversations, really sensing out the feelings and the emotions. We tend to be fairly good at that. I think what we need to do better in is actually some of the more quantitative measures. And we have to use that to drive decision making, even measuring behaviors, measuring sentiments. But on top of that, measuring the impacts of change, measuring the impacts on business performance. All of that would really help us to have a lot more influence over business decision and planning versus, I've sit in program meetings and committees where, the key decision makers are the ones with data, right? So they're the ones who are saying, this is what we found, therefore this is the recommendation we're making. If you're not coming to the table with data, you don't have a very strong voice to drive that decision making. Yeah. So I think the challenge is for us to really empower ourselves and actually come to the table with evidence.
Yes, evidence-based recommendation, and will help a lot to drive. And that seat at the table is really important. But you won't have a seat at the table unless you have done your due diligence and homework around why a particular approach you're proposing will work better. And and I completely agree. We are getting better at the soft data. And but one of the things that I did maybe recently, actually, I worked with a big retailer. I actually partnered up with a data analyst and a data scientist from the organization. Yeah, so I complemented my own capabilities, so I don't need to learn all of the things. There are different avenues to gather that. And what that also helped, it gave me another validation that somebody from within the business, having access to all the data, they can support my proposition going forward.
Yeah, look, that's a really great approach because, we cannot be anything and everything. Like we can't be data scientists overnight. We can't be data analysts, and we don't need to be. And I think you're exactly right. The challenge is how do we understand what we need and getting the outcome through data and just leveraging others so that we're actually much more equipped. So it could be leveraging others. It could be just starting small to collect some critical data that would make the most difference.
Yes.
And tapping into existing data that you already can access. And the other thing is, ideally we want to really have a picture of what's really happening in the business. And to do that, we should be looking at different types of data. It could be change data. It could be project data, business performance data, strategy data, other types of data, right? So I think the more access you have, you're able to paint a much clearer picture of what is happening or what's going to happen. And that's going to be a lot more impactful to the business as well.
Yeah, this great point, because I did use also in one of my projects, the business or the client I worked with, they use market data and so customer feedback. And I use that as well to inform how the change plan is actually enhancing and supporting that data because we were working specifically in a specific area within the business. And that specific area has been part of a customer feedback mechanism. And so I needed to show a link between the way we are implementing the change and the approach and the impact of that approach on the customer feedback data, which goes all the way to the board.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so I think what you just mentioned, the performance data, the HR data, the surveys that other business units actually conduct, I will always show interest to see it because they're all data points for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost like you're putting in different, dipsticks into different parts of the business and really seeing how do those different points add up or not add up. And it gives you a bit of guidance around what that story actually is before you make a recommendations to the business. And I think, that just, time and time again, what it reminds me of is, the importance of actually just making that investment in data itself, because when you look at businesses that have made the investment, even in just their operational data, it makes a huge difference. I think one of the McKinsey studies showed that those companies that invest in data in terms of the creation, management of data and the governance of data and giving the people access to it are twice more successful than companies that don't. Yeah.
Well, we rely on data now to make all decisions, really, especially if you run a business. I mean, you can't run a business based on a sentiment or an emotion or a whim. I mean, some people can get away with it, but not big organizations and not responsible organizations. And so I've got a question for you. If you were to give an advice now to the world of change practitioners, from your standpoint, what would that be?
Advice in terms of data and change.
If that's what you want to say, yeah.
I think the biggest challenge for change practitioners is, again, referring back to what we discussed before, organizations are transforming so rapidly at the moment that if we don't really significantly change how we do our work, there are people who say that change management can become increasingly less important in an agile world and agile practices where often, projects don't use change practitioners at all. So I think the challenge for us is how do we actually, join the data revolution to think about how we approach our work differently in how we deliver change, right? So it's everything ranging from the speed in which we're actually driving change, in measuring the change, doing the impact assessment, coming up with a change plan. Do we typically require that sort of 2-month cycle to do the change plan? Do we need to be much faster and much more agile? How do we design into that change journey for our stakeholders? And how do we better leverage data and apps and tools to be a lot more agile and savvy ourselves, right? So how do we, use tools to get better sentiments on a regular basis without impacting stakeholders? How do we measure the changes they're going to go through? How do we link that with other data points without having to rely on, again, what we talked about in terms of those very structured, before, during, after key measurements. And also I think that just how we work with the business has to change as well, in the sense that we need to involve
being agile and put this agile mindset on is a great capability to have. And I actually
ability to see how they're changing themselves.
That's great. I was thinking about this the other day. But also I think one of my lessons now is that lots of leaders and organizations, they need to understand, or they appreciate, that there's going to have to be a level of change delivery and the velocity of that change as well. So and we need to be able to articulate how our approaches are actually being upgraded all the time. But the universe now and the world is actually expecting more, not just from our practice, but from other practices as well. I mean, look at HR. Their roles are actually different now. Look at business development. Look at salespeople. And it comes all with market pressures and how we need to respond to that.
Absolutely. And that's a great example, because when you think of sales marketing people, they've got tools that they can easily access, and lots of these tools out there where they can, segment the market and actually push out emails, track the opening rates, the click-through rates, and the overall engagement of the customers that we're targeting. We could easily do that within change management, right? How do we really use the right tools to ensure that we've got a very good pulse on how our stakeholders are going to go through the interventions that we're driving? Are they clicking on the emails? Are they not reading it? How are they engaging with the content in the newsletters? Versus just hoping that, we send the email and they've got the message.
Yes.
And everything's going to go great.
Yes. Euan, we're coming to the end of the podcast, and I'm really enjoying the conversation. We covered mostly around portfolio management and the role of data. For your business, how do listeners reach out to you?
Yeah, great points, Ali. So feel free to add me on LinkedIn, Euan Wu, EUANWU. And if you want to find out more about what we do, go to our website, thechangecompass.com. And there you can get in touch with us as well. So feel free to look us up. We'd love to have a chat.
And it's a fantastic website you've got as well. I usually refer to it for some of the thoughts and information in there. So, and I steal some of your ideas, Euan.
That's great.
And look, I appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure having you, Euan, and I hope in the future we'll have you again and we cover another topic in the interesting world of change management.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Really enjoyed this, and great chatting to you as well.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Ali.
Take care. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode with Euan Wu. To know more about Euan and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. To receive more podcasts, simply subscribe. In our next podcast, we will meet with another change management specialist who will share their thoughts and ideas on change management, communication, and learning. Until then, stay well and stay safe.